I'm Elizabeth Wilson. I am the director of the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and a professor in environmental studies there. And one of the reasons I was so excited when Philippe approached me about participating in this Earth 2020 manuscript was the collection of other authors. And so this is the third in our series of Earth 2020 conversations. And today we'll be hearing from Rob Socolow, Candis Callison, Janet Herring, and Alice Gorman. And right before this conversation, we appreciated that we're speaking from Europe, from Australia, from the west coast of North America, and the east coast of North America. So together apart, we remain. And I'm excited that we're able to have such good planetary representation in our conversation on the Earth. The order of the speakers today will be first Rob, then Candis, then Janet, and then Alice. And let's kick it off with Rob. I've asked each of the speakers to give 1 or 2 sentences about who they are and where they are. And then they'll be speaking for about 6 minutes each, and then we'll be having the question and answer format moderated by me afterward. So thank you, everybody. Rob, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rob Socolow. Do you hear me? Okay, so I'm at Princeton University, now emeritus, live in Princeton, New Jersey, where I'm speaking. John Hart and I wrote a book called Patient Earth 50 years ago. It looks like this. We were assistant professors in Yale's physics department, contributing to the exciting but remote world of quarks. We become fascinated with environmentalism. We decided the best way for us to learn this new field was to create a book, partially writing it and partially editing new work that we solicited from others. We would not have revisited Patient Earth if it hadn't been for Philippe Tortel's invitation to write an introductory chapter for his book, Earth 2020. The 2 books are roughly the same length, both have multiple authors, and both highlight the interfaces between science, activism, and social change. The 2 books differ greatly, however. And it's that difference which illuminates our times, I believe. For starters, in 1970, environmentalism had hardly any past. It was frontier, now it's mainstream. We had just 2 essays that look back, one on the Dust Bowl calamity of the 1930s, and the other on the collapse of the Maya civilization. Both essays addressed the continuity of civilization. The word sustainability, however, hadn't come into use yet. In 1970, environmentalism was deeply intertwined with 3 other contemporary concerns: wilderness and the non-human environment, militarism, and population. All 3 are central themes of our book. Interestingly, they are only minor themes in Earth 2020. So let me say a word or 2 about wilderness, about militarism, and about population. We introduced the theme of wilderness and the non-human environment with our own essay on the menace to the Florida Everglades, presented by the proposed international jetport west of Miami. We also recruited essays about how the high Sierras in California were about to be invaded by a ski resort, and about how the remote woods of northern Wisconsin were threatened by an immense transmitter for submarine communications. Activists battled all 3 projects, and none was built. Today, advocates for the environment stress direct benefits to humans, so-called environmental services, rather than the intrinsic value of creatures and ecosystems that we share the planet with. Something has been lost. As for militarism, remember that in the 1970s, and the US was still prosecuting the Vietnam War, and John and I were protesting it. Patient Earth has an essay by a botanist on the use of defoliating herbicides in Vietnam to open up its forests to US bombers, and another by an international lawyer on the need to strengthen global institutions. The third, population, was discussed in practically every environmental textbook in 1970. In Patient Earth, we introduced the concepts of demography, and we recruited an essay about the state of Colorado's path-breaking initiative that loosened the restrictions on abortion. In the past 50 years, the global population has doubled, and it is still climbing. Yet environmentalists have distanced themselves from population in most discourse, including in Earth 2020. You don't learn in books about the environment today that an inexcusable number of women and men still have unwanted children because they have no access to contraception. And the flip side you don't find any welcoming stance regarding the real possibility that by mid-century, the global population may begin to decrease, giving our species an easier time accommodating to this small shared planet. John and I are proud that Patient Earth introduced the reader to no-growth economics, a heresy then, as it is still. Herman Daly's essay in Patient Earth was his first publication about the equilibrium society. But Patient Earth did not have a single essay on environmental justice. And 50 years later, neither does Earth 2020. Yet in New Haven in 1970, the worst local air quality and the most disruptive traffic arteries were in the poor neighborhoods. Racial environmental injustice accompanied income-based environmental injustice. Our omission was a consequence of our focus on the environmental problems that are generated by high consumption. The dominant perspective in Patient Earth is that the rich are over-consuming. In 1970, people described the two components of environmentalism as the green and the brown. The green is the protection of unspoiled areas. The brown is the repair of spoiled areas. Patient Earth takes on the brown with essays on herbicides, radiation, the overheating of a lake by a nuclear power plant, sulfur dioxide emissions from burning coal, and the effort to ban DDT. We taught our readers how to perform global warming calculations, and we observed that it is ominous that our capacity to change our planet has outrun our understanding of what is happening. Both books are silent about uncontrollable epidemics. Quite an omission and humbling. What will the next 50 years bring? In my own area, energy and climate, we will probably be wrestling with an electricity system largely dominated by energy that is not at our beck and call because of night and clouds and doldrums. We may be dealing again with nuclear power. We are likely to be sorting out geoengineering, the deliberate modification of our planet for nominal human betterment. The title of our book invoked the twin meanings of patient. Humanity is in a caring relationship to Earth as a doctor is to a patient. And Earth is willing to wait patiently for humanity to diagnose Earth's ailments and to find appropriate treatments. Half a century on, Earth is still our patient, but it has become impatient. What about the book to be published in 2070 that resembles Patient Earth and Earth 2020? Will its authors find notable? What will its authors find notable about the 50 most recent years of their past and the next 50 years in their future? Humanity's collective destiny is a novel, multi-generational project. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I'd like to also welcome Philippe Tortel, who appeared. So good to see you, Philippe. Next, we have Candis, who will be speaking.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to Philippe for involving me in this project. It's really great to be here with you, but also to have read through all of the essays in the book. My name is Candis Callison. I am an associate professor in the School of Journalism, Writing and Media, and in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies at UBC, the University of British Columbia. I am speaking to you from Musqueam land, which the last chapter in the book is co-authored by a young woman from this Indigenous people, but I am from the Tahltan Nation, which is located in what's now northwestern British Columbia. So I have the privilege of writing about media and how important media have been in not just circulating information, but conceptualizing what it means to live here and to live together at this moment in time, which of course, as we can all experience right now with our Zooms in front of us and with COVID-19 hanging over us, this becomes much more important, seemingly, right? And I think that's an interesting question to think about, and I hope we'll get into that a little bit in the discussion, is how important information is and what role it's playing. There's been lots of discussion about how the panic over COVID-19 has somehow replaced or erased climate change, but in fact, probably it's amplified some of our concerns. So part of the privilege of writing about media is that the 50-year trajectory from the first Earth Day to the present has been phenomenal when it comes to media. You think about the early images, which I write about, that NASA brought back, which were circulated by what was then, mainstream media, radio, television, newspapers, magazines. And the late 80s and 90s were an exciting time for media, circulating environmental information, which was new, as Rob just explained. But what happened in the 90s? The coverage of environment went way down. The coverage of celebrities, of course, went way up. And that was right as the issue of climate change in particular began to gain steam, right? This is when the reports from the IPCC began to roll out and become increasingly confident, increasingly concerned. And, you know, a lot of journalists have struggled with how to tell the story of climate change, right? One of the quotes I've used in many circumstances is that climate change is a story that oozes, it doesn't break. And this is something I've heard from many journalists over the years. And of course, we're also battling with the dominant news values of how we tell stories of what is considered newsworthy, so prominence and timeliness. And climate change has had a very big challenge with that because it doesn't have the immediate drive that, say, economic woes might have. And as well, public education has been a huge challenge for journalists to contend with when it comes to climate change, because part of what climate change requires is that audiences who are paying attention to media develop a kind of ongoing relationship with the facts. And in a book I wrote a few years ago about climate change, I argued that, you know, basically climate change is kind of a double bind, where climate change, you know, when you're reporting on climate change, you need to maintain your fidelity to the facts, but it also needs to be invested with ethics, with meaning, with morality. And that's something that journalists can't necessarily do. You know, and so in the middle of the rise of climate change as an important concern and as an issue that was continuing to be affirmed by the IPCC, we also saw media go through enormous changes beginning in the early 2000s as the internet began to change our daily lives and change the structure of our daily lives. Many of you probably woke up this morning and checked your phone first thing, right? Many of us are now dependent on these information devices that we carry around with us. And so journalism now really needs to work alongside many of the social apps that we use to navigate our day, need to also work alongside social groups who are investing issues like climate change and other environmental issues as well with meaning and with ethics and with morality, so that you know, the events that might be linked to climate change and are newsworthy might also, you know, become moments in which journalists can shed light on societal systems and structures and histories. And I think that representing the diversity of human experience is a huge challenge for journalists and for media for many reasons. But I think as we move into this era in which we're contending with pandemics and also contending with climate change, and with other environmental issues that persist, even as we're all locked in our homes, you know, we need to really begin to think closely about our relations with each other. And I argue in a more recent book about journalism that we increasingly need a kind of systems journalism that addresses how we want to live together and the histories of our relations. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I know we're going to have a great conversation afterward. Next, I'd like to invite Janet Herring. Please, a few words about yourself. Thank you.
Thanks very much. My name is Janet Herring. I'm living in Switzerland, and the picture you see in the background is from one of our labs down near the city of Luzern. I'm the director of ERWAG, that's the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, and also a professor at ETH Zurich and EPFL. I'd really like to thank Philippe for the invitation to contribute to the book. I really enjoyed that, and thanks to the organizers today for putting together this panel. So fresh water, concern about fresh water, and especially freshwater pollution, was one of the drivers of the first Earth Day. People were seeing pictures of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio on fire. They were seeing or hearing in the nightly news that Lake Erie was dead. And in those days, the nightly news, it was still a thing. I'm sure Candis appreciates that. And there were dead fish washing up on lake shores and floating down rivers. There were warning signs telling people not to even swim in some of the surface waters of the United States. And that really put a lot of pressure on the political system, and that pressure was effective. Coincident with the first Earth Day and the activism there, and I'm sure as partly contributing to that, the US Environmental Protection Agency was established. There were new environmental laws that were passed. There were old environmental laws that were updated and strengthened. And there was a very significant investment of money into upgrading wastewater treatment plants to include biological treatment. And all of those things had a good impact. They brought benefits. They actually improved the quality of surface waters in the United States. And in those days, the laws that were passed were a model for the rest of the world. They were a model even for Europe, which is unfortunately not the same thing today. And so I think now everybody knows what's coming. The next word is but, right? But, right? All these improvements, but. And there were essentially several key issues that we missed the chance to deal with properly. One is that the whole visual aspect of Earth Day was all about a pipe going into a lake or a river and gunk coming out at the end of it. It was very much focused on that point source introduction of pollutants into the natural environment. Also smokestacks, same thing. And so it's not so surprising that the solutions that people came up with had the same kind of focus, the end of pipe focus, or as close to the end of pipe as you could get. So not that we look at the whole system together in a sort of holistic way and think about optimizing the whole system. No, we think about leaving most of the system alone as much as possible and just adjusting things at the very end, or as close to the end as possible. And so that was I think, a missed opportunity. Another issue is that biological treatment, which was in fact an important improvement to wastewater treatment in the United States, it's been rapidly outpaced by the other types of pollutants that are coming into the wastewater system, particularly pharmaceuticals or personal care products or microplastics. Biological treatment, it's just not the thing for that. It was never designed that way and it doesn't work that way. So again, you have an issue where you're always playing catch up with the system. And again, because the thinking is very much just dealing with the end. Also, there was an inclusion of diffuse pollution, not just end of the pipe, but pollution coming from agriculture or other things in the Clean Water Act. But that was so much harder and so much less visible that it was just sort of left on the back burner. By the time that the visible stuff was really addressed, it's hard to move something off the back burner. So again, that's something that was sort of missed out on. And then perhaps the most important thing, and Rob alluded to this, is that the problems that were dealt with were very much problems of industrialized countries. And the problems that had been solved by industrialized countries, specifically the provision of safe drinking water and adequate sanitation, they weren't discussed at all, right? Because they weren't our problems in the United States. And the fact that billions of people did not have access to safe drinking water and sanitation was simply not part of the equation. We have made, since that time, some very major steps forward. And one was in 2010, when the United Nations declared or adopted a human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. And along with this, the nations of the world signed on to the Millennium Development Goals. And that was also a big part of the MDGs. And again, there were a lot of improvements, especially on the drinking water side, maybe a little bit less on the sanitation side. The only problem with the Millennium Development Goals is sort of the flip side. They just let the industrialized countries off the hook. They're like, oh, you know, it's about developing countries, it's about the MDGs. So when the MDGs ran out, and the nations of the world adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, they brought the industrialized countries back in. And so now the SDGs involve all countries, and they explicitly involve both people, the welfare of people, and the welfare of the planet. And so we have really a very interesting framework to look forward with. So the SDGs outline a global agenda, and they stress the interconnectedness of people and the planet. Unfortunately, in 2019, right, the SDGs should be like ramping up. We got 4 major scientific reports came out, and they all warned that the world is not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. That's the target. But, you know, scientific reports are relatively easy to ignore. What's not easy to ignore is the lesson that COVID-19 has delivered, which is exactly the same lesson. We live in a global world. We live in a globally networked world, and the health of people and animals and the planet are all interconnected. So now we've gotten our message loud and clear, and that message is that what some people call One Health is really a critical thing going forward. And the question is whether we're going to retain that message as we restart our economies. We have a big job in front of us to make investments, that public investments all over the world will be made to restart economies. And the question is whether that will go in a more sustainable direction as opposed to a knee-jerk back to business as usual. So I'm looking very, very much forward to discussing these questions with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Now we'll be hearing from Alice Gorman, and then afterwards a few words from Philippe Tortel. Please, Alice.
Hello, welcome everyone. Very exciting to be part of this panel. So first of all, I'd like to say that I speak to you from the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I'm a space archaeologist, and Philippe asked me to contribute to the Earth 2020, an insider's guide to a rapidly changing planet, to talk about what's above our heads in Earth orbit and the problem specifically of space junk. So in 1970, when the first Earth Day was held, there were about 400 active satellites in Earth orbit, ranging from low Earth orbit right up to geostationary orbit, 35,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, where most of our telecommunications satellites are. 50 years on, we have, with approximately 9,000 launches, we have about 2,000 active satellites, which carry out functions from Earth observation, weather prediction, disaster management, telecommunications, navigation, a whole range of functions that we pretty much rely on in our everyday lives in this world. And we have well over 30,000 pieces of space junk over the size of 10 centimeters. So that's like a little twisted lump of metal, 10 centimeters in size, right up to a defunct satellite the size of 2 double-decker buses. And we also have literally millions and millions of tiny fragments down to the micron size, all of which are considered to be space junk, which have no purpose for the moment and no purpose in the foreseeable future. And as we speak, we have Elon Musk's SpaceX company in the process of launching up to 12,000 satellites into low Earth orbit, the most congested region of space. So we've gone from this situation where space was, the use of Earth orbit to carry out all of these functions was, I guess, developing, to a situation where everyday life across the world pretty much depends on access to satellites. But we also have this massive problem of bits of junk orbiting at incredibly high speeds, 7 to 8 kilometers a second. And it's widely acknowledged that we need to get rid of some of this stuff. And this is all something that I very much approve of. We do need to get rid of this stuff. That might be done by trying to actively remove objects currently in orbit, and there's a whole lot of technologies that are being tested to do that. And it might be done by an orbital industry scavenging this material to use for propellant, for rocket fuel, for parts, materials, that kind of thing. We're obviously quite a long way from that point at this moment. but it is a problem that will need to be solved. From my perspective as an archaeologist, I used to work in the cultural heritage management industry, so I was very accustomed to working within an environmental management framework. This is something we don't currently have for Earth orbit. Earth orbit is barely acknowledged to be an environment, let alone have environmental values. And as Rob mentioned earlier, the thought that it might actually have intrinsic value, the thought that this thing we have created, this space above the Earth that is now filled with our material culture, which includes spacecraft and satellites that have incredible historical and social value for communities on Earth, that this might be a new entity that actually has some values in its own right. It is something that has barely crossed the minds of the engineer-dominated space industry. And yet I think this environmental perspective, which, as others have pointed out, was partially driven on Earth by the vision of Earthrise and the whole Earth and those images coming from space, a reciprocal process has not happened. This has not enabled us to look at space environments as something that might have value in their own right, and as something that we might need a more complex and nuanced approach to managing. And of course, just literally in the last few days, we have had a declaration from the US about the Artemis principles, which are how different zones of activity might be drawn up on the moon for future surface activities that involve things like space resource extraction and utilization. So these things are now starting to become critical. If we don't extend this kind of thinking from the surface of the Earth into space, we're going to, again, as Janet was saying, we're going to lose a moment here. And this is why I think the Earth 2020 volume is so important, because it captures so many of the philosophies which underpin where we are now, the trajectories and changes that we've seen, and gives us some guidance into where we might go in the future. And for me, space is an absolutely critical domain that we need. We've had people mobilized on Earth. We've had campaigns run from the grassroots as Earth Day has become. We have nothing like that for space yet, nothing. People are not thinking about it in that way. There's no one is being an advocate for the space environment. And this is something that I think is something we need to provoke, to promote in the future. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Philippe, would you like to say a few words? And then
Sure,
we'll go into the question and answer.
Sure, I'll do that quickly to the extent that my flaky connection allows. First of all, sorry, many apologies for missing out on the beginning. And secondly, thank you to all of the panelists who have joined us this morning. Thank you also to Elizabeth for jumping in to the breach, and of course to all of you for participating in this discussion. I won't say much by way of introduction, only to note that it's 6 a.m. here in Vancouver, where myself and Candis are located. And we also have Alice, who I think is at 11 p.m. in Australia, and Janet, of course, in Europe in the middle of the afternoon. And all of that really highlights what many of you have said, which is that this is an international problem, and Zoom connections notwithstanding, we are all connected to each other. And I think that was one of the real strengths of the book, was to bring people together from different countries and different perspectives to think about some of the global challenges that we face 50 years on from the first Earth Day. So that's probably all for me at the moment, and I'll hand it back to Elizabeth, who will moderate the questions, and I will probably turn off my my video to keep bandwidth down. So thanks, and looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Please send your questions to Stephanie. I'll actually start. One of the things that you said, Candis, really struck me. You know, when your comment before that climate change is like an ooze and not an event. Does our experience with COVID make us stronger and more able to deal with these global collective problems, or are we all just too exhausted now and it looks all so much more overwhelming? There's many editorials that have come out comparing COVID and climate, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that from a journalistic perspective.
Yeah, interesting question. And thanks so much for hosting this, Elizabeth. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that COVID is so immediate, right? It's when do we get to go out of our houses? When do we get to see the people we haven't seen for, you know, however long you guys have been in lockdown? This is the end of our 8th week here in Vancouver. And, you know, our kids are like, when do I get a play date? When can I see a friend besides you, mom and dad? So I think like that stuff is very immediate feeling, and climate change still really struggles with the far off sensibility about it, right? So the 1.5 degree report was really interesting because it gave us a 12-year window to think with. And I think that, you know, certainly fit more of the timeliness and more of the window that was comprehensible to wider publics. But, you know, it's still, I mean, I think there's a really interesting comparison to make about how we can work globally together, how we can think globally with regards to COVID, but it remains to be seen whether we can do that with climate. And you know, hopefully this lays down some foundations and some patterns and some systems thinking among journalists, right? I mean, that's why I think that you know, systems thinking is really familiar to us in academia, especially if you're an ecologist. You know, this is how you're trained and taught to think, but it hasn't been the way that issues like climate change have been reported on. So.
Do any of the other participants have any comments on that? I mean, how do you think the COVID experience either helps us think globally and act, or does it just fatigue us and it's all too much and we're failing just differently in different places?
I'll take a try, Elizabeth, and thank you. I didn't say it before, for you and Philippe and Stephanie for putting this together. Great opportunity to advertise a wonderful book. I hope the audience will actually go look at it. Maybe they have. I'm thinking about a particular aspect that I don't see in the press, which is how science is interacting with the public around COVID-19 and what that means for environment. Scientists have asked for science-driven policy in many areas, and we have it in COVID-19 responses for the most part, where the science is public health, and the recommendation was lockdown, and to an extraordinary to flatten the curve, have more people delay sickness until better medicine is available. Many really very persuasive arguments. A level of compliance that frankly surprised me. And now we are in phase 2, increasingly, where other disciplines, other ways of looking at the world, other value systems than the one from public health, are becoming rivals with the public health agenda. And how will that play out? It's clear that having had a period of time where climate science, where public health science dominated, we're in a new period now. And it may well be that we will learn the limitations of a totally science-driven policy, especially if we're lucky and basically get out from under this over the next while, when the public health community is saying it's too soon. The other scenario is that science will be further vindicated. Everyone will try to go back, but this is a very inelastic system. Can we really go back to lockdown? I find myself thinking about that vis-a-vis climate change, where the scientists in climate science say, we know we must get away from fossil fuels. We know we must simplify our lives to a considerable extent in the wealthy countries to make room in the atmosphere for some development in the developing countries. Their paths of development are critical. We're willing to spend a lot of money prioritizing climate science. They're prioritizing the recommendations from climate science. And how will that play out if we actually start implementing these things? Will we see something of a two-step process there too, including a lot of rejection, if we're not careful? So I'm finding myself with an agenda to think about here that I find very fascinating. I'm curious whether others of you are thinking about that too.
Well, and one of the things I think that's great about this particular call is we have people speaking from very different parts of the world with very different experiences than what's happening right now in the US. And I loved how Philippe put together, places and voices elsewhere. And there's a question coming right now in for Janet and for Candis. As Janet mentioned, scientific reports are easily ignored. Isn't scientific journalism to help bridge the gap between scientific community, common public, and most importantly, to governments? This person agrees the current COVID-19 situation really highlights the urgency for earth care. Maybe that's a new way to think about healthcare, earth care. But shall we not care about keeping the momentum? Not quite sure. Janet, would you like to take that?
Well, I do agree very strongly that science communication, whether that's journalism per se or other types of boundary organizations, play a critical role. I think scientists have a lot of information to deliver, and some scientists are actually very good at delivering that to a broader audience, not just their peers. But a lot of scientists really only communicate well to their peers, and I don't think that scientists should have to do everything. I think what we should do is be willing to work with people who can take the communication further and really make it more accessible. We have to be available to those people, and we have to have respect for what they do. And to be honest, we have to be willing to see some of the money go to what they do. One of the huge problems now, and I think Candis will agree, is that major newspapers no longer have science journalists. They can't afford it. And I don't know how we overcome that.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. And actually, we're watching as news organizations continue to shrink. There's a number of new studies out now where we're watching how COVID-19 in particular has shrunk newsrooms as well. So there's a lot of lost science expertise when it comes to journalism, particularly over the last 20 years as science sections have disappeared and science journalists have sought work elsewhere. And so I think like that's, to me, the other point, Janet, that you made earlier when you were giving your talk was about sort of the relations we have with non-humans, right? This is something Indigenous scholars have been talking about for a long time. And partly what my shorthand for thinking about systems journalism is really recognizing the way that systems and structures, have been built up over time. Many of them are rooted in colonialism, certainly in the Americas and elsewhere as well. And I think that this is the challenge for journalists is that they not only need to contend with the science, but they also need to recognize the sort of the long tendrils that science, is also implicated in, the building of nations as well, and the sort of colonialism and the challenges around infrastructure are deeply related to the way that colonialism has unfolded over time in various contexts. And so I think the real challenge with climate change, right, is how do we want to live together, but that's not disconnected from our histories of living together. And this is a challenge for media in general, right? To think more deeply about context and history in addition to the events and the science.
I'm curious from your perspectives, that question that you just asked, Candis, how do we want to live together? In this time where all of our societies are engaging differently in reopening, there's a real push here, and I'm sitting in Copenhagen, on green reopening. And this idea that our orientation towards opening in the future should be oriented towards creating a climate-friendly, more sustainable world. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts there, any of the speakers. Alice, maybe from Australia, maybe you can speak to your neighboring countries as well.
Unmute. Oh, yes, I think that's really interesting, this concept of green reopening, because it's not something I've heard over here yet. But something that really strikes me is earlier on in this whole phase, a lot of people were saying, well, we're looking at irreversible changes now. And some of those changes are edging back towards earlier periods of greater social equality and, original New Deals and all of the post-war stuff where people were like, we will never let this happen again, and we have to make sure that societies are more equal. So there was a lot of this talk early on in the COVID phase. Certainly over here now, it seems to be kind of fading away. It's sort of trickling out a little bit. And it's like things are kind of returning to business as usual, rather more quickly than I feel comfortable with. And I'm, curious to see how it's going to play out in Australia. And and the other place that I've been keeping an eye on is our Pacific Island neighbours as well, who generally just get forgotten. And of course, some of them have had massive cyclones recently, which create a whole bunch of their own issues. But I guess I'm kind of, at this moment, not filled with a great deal of optimism that we're going to see any long-term positive change from this, sadly.
Well, I would disagree on a couple of fronts. One is thinking about commuting. I used to live in Los Angeles. I'm from the US, in case people can't tell from my accent. I used to live in Los Angeles, and the pictures of the Los Angeles freeways with no cars on them, those are beautiful pictures as far as I'm concerned. And the pictures of New Delhi, where you can see all of the exquisite monuments and the skies are blue. I mean, those are fabulous pictures. And I think that people will realize and want to keep some of that nobody really wants to go back to sitting in their car for 2 hours a day each way to get to work in LA. And so I would hope that there would be some room, now that everybody is an expert on Zoom, maybe a little bit less traveling for business, maybe a little bit less commuting, not, night and day like we just did, but, maintaining some of this.
So this is more to do with our context and time. Oh, I'm sorry, Alice, please continue.
I was going to say that makes me feel very hopeful. And so I hope you're right. And there'll be a lot more of that as well.
I was just going to ask if there are any of the behaviors that people have engaged in, and if you've seen them reported in different ways that you actually think would be good to continue, both for the environment, but also from a societal perspective. And this is not as embedded in the book, but as we think about the future of how we organize our societies for the planet, in the planet, with each other. Your earlier point, Candis, deciding how we live together, I think this is a ripe time for those conversations today too.
Personally, I think there's going to be quite a package with lots of things on both hands of the scales. Public transport is, more virtual meetings instead of face-to-face meetings, especially in business, which are often expensive and wearing, I think will be a very positive change. But I do worry deeply about public transport. So many people, especially tilted toward the less privileged, spend lots of time in public transit, and public transport has been one of the top, high on the list of things we want to see increase with livable cities in order to have a greener development path. But we now associate public transport with the communication of disease. And what does that imply? It may imply very small self-driverless cars, thousands of them, and bug size that move around the highways, something getting a push because of this issue. I think there are going to be places where we're going to have negative impacts from a green agenda perspective that we're just going to have to take on board.
Philippe has your hand raised. Philippe, would you like to comment?
I actually wanted to just go back and make a comment about communications, because Candis, of course, spoke at length about that, and Janet as well addressed that. And to make the comment that there's a difference between science journalism and science communication. And this is information I've gotten actually from one of Candis's recent master's students who's written a beautiful thesis on this. And the notion of science communication as it's evolved these days really into more PR and getting the word out, so to speak, versus science journalism, which has a critical edge and a thoughtful edge, and is not necessarily taking everything on board as a cheerleader. So I think that is an important distinction. Science communication seems to be rising, as far as I can tell, whereas true science journalism is on the decline. And I wonder if Candis maybe wants to communicate about that, rather elaborate on that in the context of some of the environmental challenges we now face.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the rise of public relations. I don't have the numbers in the top of my head, but it's phenomenal when you look at the rise of PR and the amount of PR. I mean, just think about your universities, how much their PR departments have grown over the last 20 years, and how ubiquitous they are in industry. I can remember being a young reporter in the mid-90s and moving to the US, and suddenly there's a PR person accompanying every single person that you're interviewing, right? Even if what they're saying is not scary or controversial. And so I think like that's one aspect of it. And then as we've grown to need more science education and science communication, then that has also, you know, been part of the growth of the PR industry, is to have people who have become very expert at explaining science communication. Because of course, if you remember, as the IPCC reports rolled out, you know, they weren't paid attention to up until, you know, the early 2000s. And so there was this heavy emphasis upon, you know, thinking about how to get publics engaged, how to get climate change off the, you know, so-called back burner. And, you know, at the same time, science journalism, of course, was shrinking. And so you see the problem beginning, right? And partly why I have chosen in my research to really focus on journalism is because journalism, you know, really has the potential to do very critical work, to really think about what climate change means, as opposed to offering us latest insight into science, which is really what science communication does. And sometimes it's, you know, really essential to have science communicators, but they do a quite different job. And I can remember when I came to UBC, a lot of scientists were like, oh, good, you're going to help us with science communication. And I really had to, at that time, start talking about the difference between journalism and communication, and specifically how journalists have been especially pressured to move into educational roles, when in fact their job is to both inform and to ask broader questions. So yeah, thanks Philippe for bringing that up. And Philippe kindly came on the committee of one of my students and was a really terrific force for the student. Thank you.
This conversation has really sparked a thread of interest in our audience, and a follow-up on this from Amanda Graham. We're more acutely aware of the role of media and our consumption of media than ever before, and how it can both connect and disconnect us. The notion of a systems journalism is intriguing in this context. Can you tell us more about what that would look like and how that could help us navigate oozy challenges like COVID and climate? What is a systems journalist? And importantly, how do we train them?
Yeah, so this comes out of a book I just finished with my co-author, Mary Lynn Young, who's also a UBC faculty, and both of us are former journalists who've been teaching, you know, in and out of journalism schools. And really, it's bringing over some of the thinking that came out of anthropology, funny enough, where there was sort of a crisis of representation in thinking about, you know, what kind of job anthropology should do, of course, because, you know, there was a massive crisis in the 80s in general in many cultural studies fields. And so systems journalism really is what we are defining as a way of being at the intersection of processes and structures and systems, right? Such that you're recognizing that events allow us to, you know, have audience attention to look more closely at the way that infrastructure plays out. I mean, I think the other panelists today have talked about that in various ways. Rob mentioned that environmental justice often ends up not discussed. So why is that? How is it that that falls out of the public agenda? How is it that it falls out of the public discourse, right? That journalists are trying to foster and tap into. And so I think like this is the real challenge in thinking through an issue like climate change. Not only is it global and has regional and local differential ramifications, but it really taps into a much more systemic way of thinking about how we live our daily lives. And COVID has really taught us a lot about, probably our own consumption, but thinking more broadly about what we are reliant on, is a larger conversation, right? And the systems that we're reliant on to make our daily lives work and to interact with one another.
Thank you very much. From David Perlman, a common theme in Janet's comments in this session and in mine from a prior session is that while the detrimental changes in the environment are being driven by the developing world, trying to achieve a greater development, the existing overuse issues largely derive from the industrialized world. With the world being totally connected, do any of our panelists have any suggestions on how we will gain the will to lower the overuse in the industrialized nations while not denying the developing world the ability to improve living conditions?
Well, I could just say something about that, and this is just my own personal experience, so I don't know how transferable it is. But, basically everybody has pretty much stopped going out shopping to shops. I mean, some people still shop online. And also people have stopped going to cultural events and museums and concerts and things like that. I hope people take a little bit of time to think, which of those do they actually miss? I mean, do people really miss shopping? Or do they miss the experience of culture and other things? I mean, I think that the more that we can transfer value onto experience and a little bit away from stuff, the more chance it is that people in low and middle income countries will have an opportunity to come to a level of welfare and consumption that is reasonable, and that we're not basically just burning through stuff in the industrialized countries so fast anymore. So it's just hopeful, but maybe other people would also feel that way.
Alice, you had a comment that you were going to make. You had a hand up before. Please continue.
Oh, just wanted to pick up on something Candis is saying and the question about systems and systems journalism, is that part of these systems is also the infrastructure and hardware and software that allows the transfer of information. And to bring things back to my domain, some of that infrastructure is now in space and is threatened by space junk. And one of the key points about the Starlink satellite constellation and others proposed like it, which are meant to bring internet to poorly serviced parts of the world, although that's a kind of a whole question and thing in itself. So some part of that system is actually the mechanisms by which information is transferred. So part of it is literally off the earth at this point in time. So that was it.
I've just learned something in Zoom. If you're in the group chat and you push that down, it types messages and sends them to people and it doesn't unmute you. Little pro tip. But the last question, right before we close, I wanted to invite Philippe to come back and just kind of give a closing to this third and final session as well after we answer this last question. From Melanie Vasseline, I was wondering if any of the speakers could address the role and barriers posed by consumerism in the view of economic growth as a necessary good in relation to addressing climate change. Are there any lessons we may learn from the COVID experience in relation to this to avoid returning to the previous status quo? This builds on Janet's last answer and I think picks up points nicely from some of Rob's earlier comments as well as Candis's. So it seems like a nice question to kind of wrap it up. And I'll let each of the panelists kind of address that and kind of make a closing comment for about 30 seconds and then we'll wrap up the whole thing. But it'd be nice to end with hearing your voices and thoughts as well. Thank you. Let's go in the order that we started.
Right. Okay. So, of course, that's the most challenging question of all. My own hope is that our becoming conscious of future time and the collective destiny of ourselves as a species will actually have its feedback, its impact on how we think about how to live. That's why this project of Philippe's, capturing a moment and thinking about of the world in 50-year intervals, which echoed or reproduced the one that John Hart and I felt 50 years ago, makes so much sense, and has so much potential. If we see ourselves as in a moment in time, live now, the future will take care of itself, which is the way most of history has been, then I don't think we'll be self-referential about consumption at all. And I think it's going to be a very hard transition. But if the reality is that we really are determining the quality of life for future generations, rather than that they'll be more prosperous than us and therefore don't worry about them, that will be the context in which we function.
Thank you.
That's my summary.
Thank you very much. So about 30 seconds each. Thank you. And how about Candis, and then Janet and Alice?
Yeah, a really interesting note to end on. And, a lot of scholars have written about the connection between capitalism and colonialism. And obviously one of the things that, I've sort of been trying to touch on in various ways is the inequality that is so much structured into our societies as a result of both the way that capitalism operates and the long colonial histories in many countries. And so I think that, hopefully that becomes a part of the way that we think going forward in terms of who has what, and not that we all should have the same amount of stuff, but that we should all have a quality of life that is livable going forward. And to me, that's one of the root questions that's really both at COVID-19 and both regarding COVID-19 and climate change.
Thank you. Janet?
So I'd just like to come back at the end here to the Sustainable Development Goals, because the Sustainable Development Goals really do encompass a lot of these things. Sustainable consumption and production is one of the goals. Reducing inequality is one of the goals. And to the extent that countries have committed to this, I think that we have a chance to push in that direction. I think there's a lot of places where the Agenda 2030 is not so actual yet, but it really offers, I think, a huge opportunity to go to more of a green reopening. And I think that's really exactly what we need. Thank you.
Alice?
I'm thinking in response to this question of the idea that's already been widely discussed of the post-Anthropocene, where we're starting to reduce that material, the consumption and discard of massive amounts of material that create a distinct geological layer that will be visible in sections thousands, millions of years from now, that we're moving into a period where we start to reduce that footprint. We're going to be potentially rewilding places, recycling, reusing, reducing consumption, so that thousands of years from now, the COVID period may be part of a turning point that tips us into the post-Anthropocene. So that seems like a possibly positive note to end on as well.
Thank you very much. And Philippe, and then we just have a slide of upcoming events, but I really want to thank you all for participating today. It's just been a super conversation, and thank also Philippe for organizing the book and the activity and being part of these ongoing conversations. It's been really rewarding to learn more about both the authors, but also our perspective. Philippe, if you had any last comments, here's our events coming up, but please feel free to speak over them.
Just to say that, of course, be aware that all of this is available for free, so please share it far and wide and take some time with it, learn from it, and I think the biggest thing I've taken away is some new relationships, and that's really important, because at the end of the day, the way that we connect, of course, with each other and with the Earth systems is what's going to determine how we go forward. That's the last word from me.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks again for participating today. Wherever you are, stay safe and be well. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, all.